Good morning and welcome to Mobility Way's latest webinar in our Thought Leaders series. My name is Finley Johnson. I'll be moderating today's webinar, which is called SBTi Net Zero Standard, What's New? Now, we've got a packed agenda today, so we'll get underway. Brief introduction then. This webinar brings audiences into the heart of Science Based Target Initiative's latest thinking on corporate net zero. At a moment when version 2 of the corporate net zero standard is moving towards public consultation and will start to shape target validation. Now, this is being led by Maria del Mar Rojas from SBTi, and by the end of this, you should have learned more about the latest updates to the corporate net zero standard V2, including scope-specific target approach to enhance integrity and actionability, science-based options to reflect different corporate contexts, recognition for companies taking responsibility for ongoing emissions, and transparency as a lever for impact. We'll also be hearing from Jessica Wilkes-Ball, Head of Sustainability and Net Zero at Mills Reeve, about their net zero journey, their SBTi journey. Now, the webinar is 1 hour long. The format will be presentation, one from SBTi with Maria, one from Jessica at Mills Reeve, and that will be followed by a Q&A at the end. Now, the session should be interactive, so you will notice polls coming up on your screen. Please do engage with that. It'd be very interesting to see the results as we move through the webinar. For the Q&A at the end, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And please add any questions that you want to put to either of our panelists at the end of the session. One question I can answer now: yes, the session is being recorded, and yes, you will receive a copy of the recording after the event. So I'd now like to bring in Maria. So Maria is Europe Engagement Manager for the Science Based Target Initiative, and she drives efforts to support European companies and sector initiatives in setting climate-based, science-based climate targets. So, Maria, delighted to have you with us. Thank you very much for giving up your time for our audience. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thank you everyone for joining. So you've already got an introduction to myself, so I think we can kick it off. I'll be sharing a little bit about SBTi and our corporate net zero standard revision project. I do have a poll at first, just to know a little bit about who's in the audience. So if we could launch that first poll, that'd be great. And you can also, once you've answered, take a look at the agenda. Essentially, I'll be covering, as I said, a bit about our corporate net zero standard version 2 project. And by a bit, I mean actually quite a lot. I'll cover the overview of the project, going to targets setting for scope 1, 2, and 3, with a bit of a deep dive on scope 3, as there's been a lot of change there, and then talk about ongoing ambitions, and lastly, how you can participate and share your feedback through our public consultation. Okay, so maybe we can close the poll and see where things land. Okay. So most have validated targets, which is really great, or you're committed to. And for those that don't have one and are not considering it yet, I hope that after today, you'll feel a lot more comfortable and will want to set a target. So thank you so much. Let's kick it off. Next slide, please. So if you're not very familiar with SBTi, we're a corporate climate action organization. So we work with companies and financial institutions to help them play their part in contributing to our global climate goals. And we do this by developing standards, tools, and guidance to support companies in setting greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that are in line with what science says is needed to keep global heating below catastrophic levels and to reach net zero by 2050 at the latest. We have our SBTi services, where which companies can use to pursue third-party validation of the targets that they've set. And this allows them to reassure stakeholders that their targets are credible and in line with our very robust requirements. We were first founded in the run-up to the Paris Agreement. And you can see our 5 founding partners in the bottom of the slide. And since then, next slide, please. We have grown quite a bit. So, sorry, next slide. Yeah, so you can see that today nearly 12,000 companies worldwide have joined SBTi. Over 9,000 have validated science-based targets. So that represents a 45% increase in validated targets from 2024. And over 2,000 have validated net zero targets, which is a 56% growth in net zero targets from 2024. And I'll talk a little bit about how that growth is shaping globally, but really happy to say that the amount of just scope 1 and 2 emissions covered by SBTi has increased more than tenfold between 2015 and 2021. So we cover about 145 million to 1.5 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, which is equivalent to the annual emissions from Japan and Brazil combined. And again, that's just from scope 1 and 2. So really significant. And you can see also that we have over 170 financial institutions that have set targets. Next slide. So if you take one message from this pretty text-heavy slide, is that progress is far exceeding pullback. So I find it really comforting to know that there's rapid growth in science-based target setting. Despite the headlines, we really have seen that businesses are not retreating from sustainability. All of these stats are in our trend tracker, which we will be publishing regularly. So if you are curious about it, I've linked it into the slide. So as I said, target setting is continuing to increase, and so is the ambition of those targets. So in our most recent trend tracker, we found that the number of companies with net zero targets has tripled. And we've seen this significant growth in target setting across all regions. So today, companies across 70 countries and 15 industries, representing more than 40% of the global market cap, have approved emission reductions targets or commitments with the SBTi. Next slide, please. So the number of companies is not the only thing growing. Their impact and the benefits of setting targets is growing as well. So a critical mass of companies have now had targets in place long enough where we can begin to see the effects of validation. So we published a report just in the run-up to COP. Again, I've linked it here. It goes into detail on the impact of setting science-based targets from companies that have had targets for 2 or more years. And what we found is super promising. So 91% of companies set science-based targets had a positive impact on their business overall, with favorable impacts reported across reputation, strategy, and long-term financial performance. Businesses also reported that targets are helping align their supply chains, reduce risk, and boost long-term finances. So 80% of companies said science-based targets improve their strategic cohesion and long-term vision, while 74% reported stronger alignment with supply chain and customer requirements. Companies that have validated targets have also reported that they are more prepared for regulatory shifts, market disruptions, and climate-related risks, which unfortunately are only growing. So they are more resilient in the face of that uncertainty. 66% saw benefits in preparing for a carbon-constrained economy, and 62% cited greater resilience against transition risk. And lastly, targets are helping companies build trust with investors, customers, and employees, with 95% of companies reporting improved reputation and stakeholder relationships after target setting, and 80% citing a positive impact on investor perception and relations. And I didn't include it here, but they're also making more progress on their climate ambition than companies without targets. But that's all in the report, which I've linked here. Okay, now if we could launch the next poll and go to the next slide, that'd be great. So that was a little bit about science-based targets. and where we're seeing trends in the growth of companies, setting targets, on the impact of target setting. But the main thing I'm going to talk about today is our corporate net zero standard version 2. We know that the landscape of target setting is changing, and we really recognize the need for ambition and action. So we've been working on updating our flagship standard. And I'm curious to know how many of you are familiar with the corporate net zero standard already. Maybe you participated in our first public consultation. If so, thank you. And maybe you've read it, maybe you haven't read it yet, maybe you just opened it. So, or maybe you're familiar with our current standard and are curious to know what's changed. So let's see where we are. Okay, so 5 of you, thank you for participating in the first consultation. Hopefully more of you will participate in the second one. You've read, a lot of you have read it, but still plenty of you are looking to hear about it today. So that's perfect. Thank you. Okay, moving on. Next, thank you. So the corporate net zero standard was first launched in 2021, and it's, as I said, having its first major revision, which is in line with our governance structure, which requires that all standards be updated every 2 to 5 years. We have this time frame in place to make sure that SBTi and companies aligned with SBTi standards are staying up to date with the latest climate science as well as the best practice. So our ultimate goal is to produce an updated corporate net zero standard that maintains scientific ambition while being more inclusive, actionable, and adaptable, so that we can support more companies to set targets and accelerate the pace of decarbonization. So let's look at where we've been. Sorry, next slide. Yeah, so let's look at where we've been and where we're going. The initial public consultation closed on June 1st. It was the first opportunity for broad input and feedback. Since then, we've analyzed more than 860 responses to that first survey and convened 5 expert working groups. We've also run pilot testing survey that closed in mid-August. We've taken all those learnings and used it to inform the second public consultation draft, which I'll share today. It was published on November 6th, and as a reminder, the deadline for submitting your feedback is December 12th at 9 a.m. UK time. We're also, while doing this public consultation, we're having a second phase of our pilot testing process, which is a much more in-depth process with 70 globally and sectorally diverse companies, and it's helping us get more detailed insight and input into the feasibility of key proposals in the standard. So our aim is to take all of that feedback on board and develop a final draft for approval by the SBTi Technical Council and our board in 2026. Next slide, please. So you can see here the breakdown of who we heard from. As I said, 860 responses across the globe. Most responses are coming from industry, not surprisingly. And I've also linked in here the full report from that first consultation, if you're curious, so you can see how much support different proposals received. Next slide. So just a quick disclaimer, as I've said a couple times, this is a consultation draft. So all the proposed changes or modifications are just that, they're proposed, so they're not yet final. And all changes and modifications are subject to SBTi's governance procedures. So as I said, there's still a pilot, there's still this consultation, and things are in flux, but we have gotten to a very good standard, which I'm excited to share today. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about some of the key updates in the standard. If you're familiar with the first consultation draft, you will see that some concepts have carried over. such as the company categorization framework. So the company categorization framework proposes two overall categories for companies, category A and category B, which is determined by the company size and geography. So the company size is defined by a combination of headcount, financial criteria, and emissions quantity, while country location, for that we've used the World Bank's economic income categories. And the idea is that this categorization then determines which criteria will apply to the company. So for example, in some cases, a criterion is required for a category A company, but optional for category B companies. Before we move on, I just want to point out that at the bottom right hand of our slide, you can see a page icon and a page number. It basically just points you to where you can find more detail about this within the draft, and you'll see that I've included it throughout our presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through the overall structure, chapter by chapter, of the Corporate Net Zero Standard, just to give you a good sense of the content at a high level. So I do recommend reviewing the consultation draft if you can, so you can find out more information about each topic. But this helps you figure out what areas you might want to dive deeper into. So on the net zero ambition, this was formerly called our net zero commitment, and sets out that companies must set an ambition to transition their operations and value chains in alignment with the goal to be net zero by no later than 2050. In this chapter, we also have the requirement that category A companies must publish transition plans within 12 months of having their target validated. And then on base year assessment, we have the requirements related to developing a greenhouse gas inventory, selecting a base year, and assessing the applicability of other relevant target setting metrics and sector-specific SBTi standards. This chapter also contains the requirement that category A companies would obtain a third-party assurance of the values relevant to their target setting, but we are consulting on the level of assurance. The next chapter is on target setting. And here you'll find all the requirements related to setting targets on scope 1 to 3. This is followed by a chapter, just click for the animation, please, which details how companies can take responsibility for ongoing emissions. But I'll go into more detail across these four. And then the next chapter, click please, is on assessing performance and renewing targets. So this contains target recalculation requirements, as well as guidance for assessing and transparently disclosing progress against targets, including performance at the end of target cycle when setting new targets, so that we can ensure continued alignment with a net zero transition. And it also requires disclosure of barriers and emerging gaps in addition to successful progress. And finally, there's a chapter on SBTi claims. This chapter introduces general criteria for substantiating claims related to science-based target setting, SBTi validation, and target progress. So the aim is to enable companies to communicate their efforts in a clear and credible way. I'll just say that, again, there's a lot to cover in the draft standard, and we really hope you'll be able to send your feedback if you would like. Know that in the survey, you can pick and choose what sections to answer, so you don't have to go through the full survey, and really you can provide feedback where you think it'll be most helpful or where you have most to say. So moving on to target setting. Okay, next slide, please. On scope 1, consistent with the first draft, companies must set separate targets to cover scope 1 emissions, and 100% of scope 1 emissions must be covered. And let's look at what has changed since the first draft. You can see that on target methods, we landed on a calculation method for determining reduction requirements in the scope. Of two different options that we had explored in the first consultation, we have moved forward with the linear contraction approach. We have also introduced two new target methods to address scope 1. The first is the asset decarbonization plan, and we also have alignment-based targets. And finally, the first consultation draft suggests that long-term targets will be mandatory for scope 1 and 2 for all companies. The second consultation is exploring which companies should be required to set long-term Scope 1 targets, including the options of all Category A companies or all companies with specific emissions profiles, or using specific target setting methods as well. So that's what we're consulting on specifically for Scope 1. Now on to Scope 2. Next slide. So what's new on Scope 2? Actually, a lot. In this new draft, on the target boundary, we've introduced a potential mechanism for limited exclusions from the otherwise 100% target boundary on emissions from purchased electricity for near-term targets. We're also differentiating between electricity and heat, steam, and cooling for target coverage, with the latter being excluded if it's less than 5% of overall Scope 2 emissions. On target methods, we have shifted that zero carbon electricity label to a low carbon electricity label, which we're defining as electricity generated with direct greenhouse gas emissions equal to or less than 0.024 kilograms CO2 per kilowatt hour. And for near-term targets covering electricity emissions, the only requirement is now an alignment target, which are targets that linearly increase the percentage of low carbon electricity purchased or matched through ACs to 100% by 2040. Emission reduction targets based on location or market-based metrics are now optional and would be additional to that alignment target. So again, this means that mandatory location-based electricity target has now been removed. We got a lot of feedback on that. And then on purchasing requirements, we introduced matching criteria. Hourly matching will be gradually phased in for companies with aggregate annual electricity consumption of more than 10 gigawatt hours within a single region of physical deliverability in that base target base year. And sites where annual electricity purchasing is less than that less than megawatt hours, 100 megawatt hours may be excluded. So we've done a lot of research, listening, and deliberation within the expert working group to land on enhanced quality criteria and integrity principles for EACs. I'm not going to cover those today, but I've included some detailed slides in the appendix that will be shared with you. And there's also a lot more on our website and in the standard itself on this. And lastly, just worth mentioning that long-term targets are required for Scope 2, and these must cover 100% of electricity, steam, heat, and cooling. So at a high level for near-term targets, we're differentiating between electricity, heat, steam, and cooling, and focusing on alignment targets, which are, again, the only electricity targets required in the near term. And companies can set those additional near-term targets on electricity using either location-based or market-based Scope 2 emissions metrics. And for heat, steam, and cooling, companies can exclude these emissions from near-term targets if they have less than 5% of location-based Scope 2 emissions from these sources. If they do exceed that threshold, then an emissions metric target must be set using either location or market-based accounting. Okay, now on to Scope 3. Sorry, you can't tell, but I am 9 months pregnant and my diaphragm, it's very easy to run out of breath. So apologies for all the breaks, but I'm excited. We're here onto Scope 3. The draft has introduced a focused and flexible framework for Scope 3 target setting. What has stayed the same is that the Scope 3 target boundary has been refined and requires that companies identify and set targets to cover emissions from significant Scope 3 categories. And we define significant Scope 3 categories as any category that's contributing equal to or more than 5% of total Scope 3 emissions. And consistent with that first public consultation draft, near-term Scope 3 targets are required for Category A companies, but they're optional for Category B companies. And long-term Scope 3 targets are optional for all companies. Now, what has changed since the first draft? On target boundaries, focus targets are required on priority emission sources within those significant categories. On target methods, we introduced a new alignment target for Scope 3 in the first consultation draft. We've now expanded this further to a larger set of options for near-term target setting methods, which I'll go into a lot more detail momentarily. And please note that mandatory supplier engagement targets have been removed. And finally, this draft clarifies the actions that can be taken to demonstrate progress against Scope 3 targets across a variety of intervention levels. We've changed the language slightly to include at the activity, value chain, counterparty, activity pool, and sector level, which, again, we've changed the language from the first draft where we reference this as direct and indirect mitigation. Next slide. So we have an expanded set of target setting metrics for Scope 3. These methods can be classified at a high level as emission intensity targets, volume alignment targets, and counterparty alignment targets. You can see them, they've been color-coded in the slide. And two of these are not entirely new targets. So the emissions intensity target is an evolution of our existing physical emissions intensity targets. And it requires that procured commodities meet the average emissions intensity benchmark for that commodity and target year. The counterparty alignment target is an evolution of our existing supplier or customer engagement target, which you might be familiar with. If set to cover suppliers, then that target would be to increase the share of spend with tier 1 suppliers that have aligned status. And aligned status means the supplier has set or is implementing a target consistent with reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and demonstrates measurable progress over time. The remaining 6 methods are being introduced via our new standard. So the first, there's 2 additional counterparty alignment targets. One is the counterparty energy alignment, where companies are looking to increase the volume of low carbon energy usage by suppliers and or their customers. And this would be measured by a % share of total energy usage by suppliers and or customers that qualifies as low carbon, using the definition that I shared previously in Scope 2. And the second is the Zero Tailpipe Emissions Vehicle, or ZEV, adoption, which looks for companies to increase the % of total transport activity delivered through ZEVs. Then we have 4 types of volume alignment targets. The volume alignment target on the top row would see companies working to increase the share of low carbon activities. So for example, at least 95% of transportation activities would meet the reference intensity benchmarks. Next, there's a revenue phase out or sales alignment plan. And these are options that we're consulting on as they apply specifically to fossil fuel products. We also have energy efficiency targets, which would require that companies increase the share of revenue or units sold from electrified products that meet best practice energy efficiency standards on a linear trajectories from the target base year to at least 95% by 2040. And finally, we have circularity targets, and these would require that companies increase the share of sold products that have verified circular end-of-life solutions, following a linear trajectory from the target base year to at least 95% by 2050. And there is a requirement that for these circular end-of-life solutions, you can demonstrate credible circular economy product standards. So there's more detailed information on particular thresholds and benchmarks that are referenced in our Annex A of the draft standard. Next slide, please. So given that there's now an expanded set of methods, I think it's helpful to look at what it would look like to set a target using these new Scope 3 requirements. So first, companies would need to map out all their Scope 3 activities. They would need to include 100% of Scope 3 emissions in their inventory. And then they would identify the significant Scope 3 categories. So again, this is defined as categories contributing 5% or more of overall Scope 3 emissions. Then companies should apply eligible exclusions, and we have detailed these potential exclusions in the draft standard. So they include things like emissions from upstream leased assets where the company has no operational control. And then companies must review the significant scope 3 categories to identify priority emission sources. And the intention here is that companies are focusing on what is material for their business. So that's significant categories, but also that they're setting specific targets on what is critical for the global transition as well. So for that, we are defining these as priority emission sources, and they must each be addressed with individual targets through eligible target setting methods, which I have more information on in the following slide. So they include priority commodities, so energy intensive industrial commodities and land use intensive flat commodities. And again, there's a table listing these priority commodities in Annex A. And if you can click, please. We have the fossil fuel emissions. So the draft requires the use of sold product emissions from fossil fuels must be covered by targets. And this can include the direct sale of a fossil fuel, so coal, oil, or gas, the sale of services that support fossil fuel extraction, like processing, distribution, marketing, as well as the sale of products that consume fossil fuels or of products that contain or form greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted during the use phase. And one more click, please. The last priority emission source is the use of sold product emissions from sold electrified products. Next slide, please. So the next step, I don't know if you've been counting, but step 4 would be to set targets to address the significant categories and priority emission sources identified. So the draft standard details the eligible target setting methods for the scope 3 categories listed here. You can kind of see a menu of options, and you'll notice the eligible target setting methods for each priority emission sources. Those have been highlighted in light orange. Please note that 2 eligible target setting methods for the fossil fuel related priority emission sources are under consultation, whether it be option 1, a revenue phase out, and option 2, a sales alignment plan. And so once companies have mapped out what targets to apply to individual scope 3 categories and priority emission sources, they can aggregate that target and have an overarching ambition statement. So they can basically have a commitment to address a percentage of their scope 3 emissions by their target year. So the key thing there is really that you can aggregate them. So there's lots of options, but there is one aggregate that you can have at the end. Next slide, please. And once you have those targets, how do you demonstrate performance against them? So companies can apply actions across 4 intervention levels. First, we have the activity level, which is where you are addressing a specific and traceable emission source within your value chain. So steel, cement, or chemicals that you're purchasing directly from suppliers, for example, and showing improvements in performance over time. Next is the counterparty level. So that's looking at the entity, so a specific supplier or a customer, and whether they've set a science-based target and over time are performing against that target. And then there's the activity pool, where a company might not have traceability to the individual emission source, but they can procure a functionally equivalent good or service that's within a clearly defined geographic or operational boundary. So some examples, you can see some examples of activity pools. They include things like an energy shed, or if you're sourcing cocoa from a region, this kind of defined geographical boundary. And finally, we have the sector level, where you're engaging in an intervention that is no longer physically connected to your value chain, but is driving comparable impact. So that can be unbundled EACs. And this sector level intervention is only suitable for companies where there's no available technology to decarbonize the actual activity that is physically in their value chain. So that technology is at a very early stage or not feasible to source within their own market. And companies will have to justify which approach they've taken to address emissions within their target boundary. Please know that through the second consultation survey, we're seeking feedback about both activity pools and sector level interventions. And we have questions in there related to guardrails and quality criteria, as well as if there are other options for addressing emissions at either level that we should be considering. Next slide. And moving on to ongoing emissions, consistent with previous versions of the standard, we require that companies neutralize residual emissions. So this is something that we have in our standard right now. We are now proposing that beginning in 2035, Category A companies would be required to address part of their ongoing emissions with removals, ensuring that an increased proportion of these removals deliver long-lived storage. And we're consulting on whether 2035 is the right milestone year to introduce this mandatory requirement, and what portion of ongoing emissions Category A companies should be required to address initially and in the lead up to that target year. And then we have additional detail and criteria on removals that will be specified in future revisions of the standard, so prior to that 2035 deadline, just because we want to have the best available science that be aligned with the best available science and technology available at the time. Next slide. And so you might be familiar with our Beyond Value Chain work. We've had 2 reports on it. And in the last standard, we said that we would offer recognition. We've now refined this further in the standard and have a process for having additional recognition for those companies that are addressing emissions that they will continue to emit even as they make progress in decarbonizing on the path towards net zero. So we've shifted away from a terminology and are moving more towards a recognition and responsibility framework that addresses ongoing emissions inclusive of residual emissions. So it's a cyclical framework and it offers a recognized status. So to earn recognized status, companies must take a responsibility for at least 1% of ongoing scope 1 to 3 emissions within their near-term target cycle. It's a low threshold. It's been set intentionally low in order to ensure feasibility and accessibility across sectors and regions. But there is a higher status, the leadership status, which companies to earn must take responsibility for 100% of ongoing emissions within the near-term target cycle. Okay, next slide, please. So I hope you're feeling somewhat more oriented to our new version 2 draft and more prepared to participate in the public consultation. So to get involved, I've shared here where you can read and reflect, read a little bit more about the standard. You can also submit your response. Apologies, I realized the slide says December 8th, but as I mentioned, it's December 12th now. So we've had a small extension. So you have until then to submit your response. And we also hope that you will share this public consultation with your networks, as we're really looking to have a broad range of responses and ensure that that standard that we have ready for you next year in 2026 is inclusive, applicable, and relevant. So thank you so much.
Maria, brilliant. Thank you ever so much. That was really informative. We've had a number of comments saying the same, and also some messages of congratulations, which I echo as well. We know Maria is going to be sticking around for a Q&A towards the end of the session. But before that, we're also going to be hearing from Jessica Wilkes-Ball, who is Head of Sustainability and Net Zero at Mills Reeve, to hear about their SBTi journey. We'll be bringing Jessica in shortly. Before that, we have a very short impact story from Mills Reeve. So can we play that now, please?
We are around about 1,400 staff now, and we are very proud of our heritage here in Norwich, but also very proud about what we're doing in terms of committing to sustainability, commitment to net zero, and also committing to our people, planet and our clients. When we looked at where the biggest emissions profiles were, the second biggest one was around travel and commuting. We employed Mobility Ways to help us with our travel survey. It was very easy for us to get people on that journey with us because, we teed them up into why we're doing this. The questions that we ask are very measured, and the data and the drilling down of that Mobility Ways do for us has been absolutely invaluable. We have 3 years worth of fantastic data to show what those trends are, but also what the business needs to invest in terms of future-proofing us to make sure that we're going to hit those targets.
I think we have got more issues when it comes to the availability of public transport. 10% of our colleagues are already lift sharing, which is fantastic, out of an employee workforce of around 250. We've also established that there's about 28% of colleagues who live within close proximity to 10 other colleagues, so there should be a range of options. It'll make it far easier for them to see where their opportunities are to lift share.
Mills Reeve are very proud to have had our net zero targets verified by the Science Based Targets Initiative. It's the world-leading organisation for verification and also the scrutiny of our net zero targets. Sustainable commuting is for us a really big ambition towards how we're going to achieve our science-based targets. Through the work that Mobility Ways have done, we've been able to map the options for people to be able to get into the office, whether that's train, whether that's a bus, whether that's a park and ride scheme, or whether that is unfortunately people who are having to come in by a car because there is no other option. But as part of that, what does a car share look like for those individuals? Could we be looking at offices that are, when we are looking to move, that are located to the best public transport links? We can really dial into what that critical data is in terms of each office profile. We have ambitions to be able to create a dashboard for each office and have a bit of a leaderboard. Us being able to provide our staff with a whole list of activities that we're doing in terms of how we're going to reduce our emissions not only helps them have a sense of purpose, but it also helps them to be able to talk to our clients with a real authenticity when it comes to, how are we going to achieve our net zero targets?
Okay, so we'd now like to welcome Jessica. Jessica, great to have you with us. Thank you ever so much for joining us. And love to hear a little bit more about your SBTi journey. So, indeed, over to you.
So it is still the morning, so morning everybody, and I'm just going to do a very quick whistle-stop tour because I know we want to make sure we've got time for questions. So Mills Reeve, I'm Head of Sustainability and Net Zero for Mills Reeve. We're what we call a full-service law firm. We have 7 offices in the UK. We don't have any international operations ourselves, so that makes some of our emissions calculations slightly easier, but we still have some complexities as any professional services firm does. You'll see that we have a timeline of how we're going to achieve our net zero targets, and these were approved by the SBTi in April 2025. We committed back in 2022, and then we've then spent the 3 years up until 2025 really delving into that data. As Maria said, the links on the slides, everything is available on our website, and there is time for questions after this. So can we go to the next slide, please? Amazing. So we have followed the pathway with SBTi and looking at what our near-term and long-term targets are. We are really proud that for a law firm of our size, we have these targets approved by SBTi. We're quite a select few in that sort of regard. There was an article from The Lawyer, which is the leading publication for law firms, and we were publicly mentioned for the amount of transparency that we have around our targets, but also the transparency around what our emissions profile actually is. We publish our full greenhouse gas emissions every year. We're just about to press publish on our new ones. And we find that that actually is really important for us because we don't want to hide behind the science. We don't want to hide behind what the sort of the high level numbers are saying. We want to be really honest with people about just how big the challenge is. Now, as a professional services firm, most of our emissions are in our scope 3. That's where our biggest challenge is. And within that, I think probably the three biggest sections are purchase goods and services, business travel, and commuting. Now, you'll have seen from the little video before this that we've been working with Mobility Ways for a number of years, and having them as a really critical friend in looking at what our emissions profile is when it comes to commuting data has been absolutely invaluable. Our business is growing. We're gaining more clients. We're employing more people. More people are traveling to and from offices. We do have a hybrid working model. So we're expecting people to be in the office around about 50% of the time. So, we are seeing what those trends are. And as part of that, we're able to look at the scenario modeling of what that could look like with and without intervention. So things like a lift share scheme, rolling out EV schemes through salary sacrifice, and looking at smarter ways in which we travel, and also encouraging people to think about how and when they do travel, and is there an opportunity to raise the awareness of the options that are out there, but also recognizing that people do have a whole myriad of reasons for choosing the way that which they commute. So how can we enable people to be fully supported while also making more sustainable decisions? We have also set some near-term things, targets, but also some KPIs under that. A 4% annual reduction in emissions across all scopes, using emissions factors rather than spend-based for suppliers and travel data. I imagine a lot of people on this call are in the same boat with us on that. Looking at travel commuting projects, as I've said, and looking at our operational emissions as well. So I'm going to deeper dive into some of that. So can I have the next slide, please? So this is how we're going to get there. We're looking at our net zero and emissions reduction. So we've got 2033 as our near term and 2050 as our long term. Anybody who's been through the SBTi process knows that you have to revalidate and resubmit your targets within 5 years. I'd like to do ours slightly earlier than that. A, because I'm a bit of a data nerd, but B, because we're going to see over the next 12 months some really big implemented changes in how we collect that data. And we feel that actually waiting 5 years could do us a bit of a disservice. So we're aiming for probably 2027 to re-baseline those emissions for us. And obviously with the consultation, the protocol out at the moment, of which I did do quite a bit of a deep dive into last night, looking at how that could affect our emissions profile and what does that look like in terms of that re-benchmarking. We're looking at engaging our people and our communities and increasing our governance of what it is we're trying to do as a firm. Looking at energy reduction and resource efficiency, and ensuring that whatever we maintain in terms of our environmental certifications, we continue to do that. And also 3 nature and biodiversity investment projects. If you are interested, there's plenty of information out there about Mills Reeve and Make It Wild on the screen, but we've also worked with an organisation called Smallwoods, which is near me in Shropshire. And we're really committed into investing every year in at least 3 projects across the country to support the investment into nature and biodiversity. If anybody wants any more information about that, I could talk about it all day. But again, there's plenty of time for Q&A at the end of this, so please do chop in. If there isn't time on this, I'm sure I'm happy to take questions or, connect with me on LinkedIn and we can continue the conversation there. So this is how we're going to get there. And I think for me, it is a challenge, but the biggest piece of advice I can give to anybody on this call is it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. I'm going to try not to use too many cheesy analogies, but that is true. But secondly, we're all in this together, and this is not a competitive market. This is all about collaboration. We're really privileged to be able to have, the backing of SBTi. We've worked with an organisation called Ecology who've helped to really validate our data and have done all of the heavy lifting for us in terms of getting those targets to SBTi. If you have the budget to be able to get a consultant in to help you, please do, because it is a minefield. You can't do this on your own. And I think that's been one of the biggest takeaways for us. And then I think, having other brilliant partners like Mobility Ways, we couldn't be where we are, and I'm going to again be a bit cheesy here, but we couldn't be on this journey without them. The data that they give us, they're a friend to the firm. We don't just see them as a supplier. We can pick up the phone, we can drop them an email. They're always coming up with new ideas, new initiatives, helping us to think about what it is we're really trying to achieve. Our strapline in Mills Reeve is achieve more together. And I think if we go on to the next slide, I can give you a little bit more into that. This is where I go. Here we go. Right. So achieve more together is how we're trying to live our purpose and what our North Star is. So, we're ambitious, we're open, collaborate, and we care. And I think throughout all of this process, I've been in role nearly 4 years, and from where we were to where we are now, it's been a massive step change. But now we've got to bring everybody on that journey with us, and we've got to really start to get people to understand that even the smallest incremental change can make a bigger difference overall in terms of our emissions reduction. And having experts such as Mobility Ways and SBTi to jump onto calls with us, with our colleagues, to say, it's not just us in the little sustainability team of 2. There are brilliant people out there who can really be advocates for what it is you're trying to do in your business. Sustainability as a role can be quite a lonely world. You're sort of on the side of the desk in facilities, or like me, you're in your own responsible business team. And some people perhaps don't see you as a help. They see you perhaps more of a hindrance. You turn up to a meeting, they're like, oh, what they're going to tell us we can't do now. It's not about that. It's about upskilling. It's about collaborating. It's about having really open conversations, and also really remembering that going forward, none of us are going to have a massive impact on the environment unless we make 1 or 2 small changes ourselves. And, we've had a really hot summer, potentially going to have a really cold winter. Flooding has been increasing, and climate change is real. Climate change is out there. We're living it every single day all over the world. So anything we can do to try and mitigate some of that, I think, can only be a good thing. And I'm going to think that's my last slide, Finley, I think. If you want to go to the next one, there you go. And that just gives you what our commitment is. Again, all of it's available on our website. We're really transparent when it comes to what it is we're trying to do. And also when perhaps we don't get it quite right. Our Scope 3 emissions this year have shot up, but we're spending more and we're travelling more. And until we get a handle on what that data looks like and moving from spend to direct emissions based, it is going to do that. That's what it is. That's what it's going to be. And sometimes it's good that things go up in the wrong way, because it then helps you to implement things to then start to bring it down and mitigate it going the other way. So hopefully you've got time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Jessica. Yes, we do have time for questions. You can see there's a slide on there at the moment about an upcoming webinar. So if you're interested, go on the Mobility Ways website, and all of the upcoming events are listed there in the Insight Articles training section. So we have got lots of questions coming through. Of course, we are a bit limited on time. So what I've done is kind of looked through the questions and tried to amalgamate as many as possible. Any unanswered, we will try and get those answered offline. So just bringing back Maria and Jessica into the room. Maria, thanks once again. Really informative. I think in light of your presentation, we've had lots of questions from organizations around how they should approach target setting. So could you tell us, should companies continue setting targets using the current version of the standard?
Yeah, absolutely. So the current standard is the best framework for setting net zero targets. So definitely, if you haven't set a target, use the current standard. The corporate net zero standard version 2 will be available next year. So then companies will have a choice to use our version 2 or our version 1.3. But companies are not required to use the version 2 standard until January 1st, 2028. from then on, companies will have to use it. And we will also be providing additional guidance on how to transition your targets if you already have targets. And if you have near-term targets, you're not required to use the version 2 standard until your targets, until you need to revalidate. So companies that have targets will know it's a 5-year cycle.
Okay, and Jess, having read the draft, I think you said last night, but I know you've looked at it prior to that. But how have you found this proposal has impacted your thinking, and indeed has it?
I think the work of the SBTi is really valid, and what they're trying to do with this consultation is going out and looking at ways in which it's to help people, I think, more than a hindrance. It's much more transparency. It's making sure that people are fully aware of what it is they're actually stepping into, because I think sometimes, you get asked by a senior leader going, oh, we must have SBTi targets, without fully understanding what the implications could be. And I think, the new version is much more transparent when it comes to that. I think in professional services, it's harder for us because we don't make a product. We're not really a dirty industry when it comes to that. So having more guidance around that scope 3 piece will be really invaluable to us, because that gives us the weight to then go back to our senior leaders to say, well, we could be doing this, but actually we should really be doing that because it will make a bigger difference here. So it gives us that extra validated evidence to start to move the dial forwards.
Got you. Okay. And in terms of actually looking through, we've had quite a lot of questions that they're quite specific to particular industries. So I guess rather than going into each of those, would it be possible, Maria, maybe you could tell our audience how SBTi is helping companies kind of navigate this increasingly complex landscape, and if you've got any guidance, or you can redirect our audience to any resources that they could find more detail about their kind of sectors, anything sector specific, that would be terrific.
Yeah, so we operate on a modular structure, so meaning that our corporate net zero standard is your entry point to setting science-based targets, but we also have sector standards. So when a company meets a specific threshold, they have to use our sector standards. So those sector standards, we have 11. There's been a question about the timber and wood fiber pathway, which is under flag, for example. We have steel, cement, buildings. So if you fall, worth looking in our website to see what sector standard specific guidance we have. And again, on the transition piece, we will have additional guidance on how to transition. And maybe I can use this to say a little plug that we have a new validation portal. So if you set your targets before last year, we have a validation portal that has really streamlined that process and made it very user-friendly. So it's all through the portal. And validation takes about 30 days for a near-term target, 60 days for a net zero target. So I've gotten questions around how are you going to handle this new volume? We are prepared and very happy to, because it means that there's progress on climate action.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much. We are, unfortunately, it's been a really jam-packed session. We wanted to make sure we got a lot of the information from your presentation over. I think I will ask one more kind of question to conclude this, but as we're approaching the end of the session, just like to say that any questions that we've had through, because there have been a lot, perhaps we can get that over to Maria or someone at SBTi, and we hopefully get some responses over to our audience. I guess one more question here, just in terms of the validation, because it seems to be a bit of a recurring theme around whether there's plans to reduce any of the waiting times in validating targets, particularly considering a potential influx post CNZ kind of V2 release.
Yeah, so that's where the portal is really helpful. If you are just starting to navigate this, we also have a navigator on our services page. That's a very helpful guide in terms of where you fall in the company categorization as it's now, which is corporate or an SME, and whether you need to use our additional criteria for sectors, as I said. So all of that is really set to go. I am going on maternity leave, as I've said, but please do send those questions over. Thank you so much for having so many great questions. We also have an FAQ, which is getting updated. We have visual guidance, we have videos, we have a lot of resources, and we have them in different languages as well. There was a question around having getting different perspectives in the public consultation, and it's something that we really focus on a lot. So we have all of these resources in different languages.
Yeah, I did see that one, and likewise, there are lots of other questions that we would love to have got over to you. And unfortunately, we didn't have time today. I'd just like to say thank you ever so much, Maria and Jessica, for giving up your time. Really, really insightful, and thank you for your presentations. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. Once again, any questions we weren't able to answer, we will endeavour to get back to you with an answer as quickly as possible. There have been questions about the recording, the slides. We're going to follow up after this webinar with an email detailing everything. And if you would like to watch this recording back, of course, along with a number of the other webinars in our series and what's coming up, then Mobility Way's website or Mobility Way's Eventbrite page has all of the details. So I think that's it. It's possibly lunchtime, but it's certainly the end of this session. Thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.